All right, continuing the theme this week of sort of doing some ranking videos, right? Monday, I ranked my top 10 teams. And then Tuesday, I ranked sort of my 5 favorite coaches. Not necessarily the best coaches, but my 5 personal favorites. Go back and watch those 2 videos if you haven't had a chance to see them yet. No video yesterday. Was out of town. Today, continuing with these rankings, what I'm going to do today, I'm going to rank the Power 5 conferences from worst to first. What a novel idea. Let's go. All right, here we go, ranking the Power 5 conferences from worst to first. Start with 5, working our way down. Number 5 here. You know what? I give a lot of credit to whichever conference wins the national title. I've been doing that forever. To me, that has to mean something, and it bumps your conference up a little bit when you have the best team in all of college football in that conference. Unfortunately, that just wasn't enough for the ACC this year to get out of the basement. I have ACC ranked 5th, the worst of the Power 5 conferences. Now, let me answer this question first. Am I ranking what they did last year or what I think they'll do next year? It's sort of a combination, okay? I mean, obviously, I have to take into account what they did last year. That's really the most recent data we have to go on. And I also think that this will be the ranking that they end up with at the end of the 2019 season. So I guess what I'm doing is ranking what I think will be the order of the Power 5 next season, but I'm using a lot of data from 2018 along with things like recruiting classes, players that left for the NFL, schedules, things like that, but that's sort of the best way I can explain it. But yeah, ACC's got to be 5th, I think. Well, where do we start here? Okay, first of all, like I mentioned, congrats to the ACC. They have the best team in college football in 2018, and it wasn't even close. They proved that all during the regular season, and they proved it in their 2 playoff games, the beatdown of Notre Dame in round 1 and the dismantling of Alabama in the championship game. Clearly the best team, no debate, no argument. There's no other team that you can say, maybe they could have beat them if things had gone different, nothing like that. Clemson completely dominated, 15-0, first team to do it. Shout out to the Tigers. Unfortunately for the ACC, that's really the end of the good news. There really is not even a second good team in the ACC. There's a lot of teams that have some potential to be good, and there's some teams that over the last 15 or 20 years have been great. But unfortunately for the ACC, those teams, which the ACC has relied on really over the last 10 or 15 years to sort of prompt their conference up, higher up towards the front of this list, those teams are just really, really struggling right now. Doesn't mean they can't get it turned around quick in next year, 2019 in some cases. But they're just really struggling right now after Clemson, honestly. 4 teams with a losing record last year. Not good. Louisville and UNC both won 2 games each. I think they're the only Power 5 conference that had 2 teams only win 2 or less games. So that's terrible. 2 of the worst teams in the Power 5, Louisville and UNC. 2-win teams. Now, they both have new coaches for 2019, so some reason for optimism. But talent level is just not there for those 2 teams in terms of trying to be ranked or, much less a top 10, top 15 team. They're still going to be bad teams. UNC, of course, gets Mac Brown back after a long time at Texas and then some time in the broadcast booth. They dust him off. He's back at North Carolina. I do think North Carolina will improve over what they had last year. They get a lot of the pieces back. They won't be a 2-win team next year, but they're still a long way from mattering. Louisville, I think, is closer to being a bowl team immediately than UNC is. It wouldn't surprise me. I don't think it would surprise anybody really, considering how weak the ACC is overall, if Louisville rebounded and won 6 or 7 games this year. So I could see that happening. Now, some of the bigger concerns here. Florida State, 5-7 last year. A terrible year by Florida State standards. Willie Taggart, it hasn't worked out down there for Willie Taggart. Now, I'm not saying that means it's not gonna, but it hadn't so far. This is a make or break year, in my opinion, for Willie Taggart. You can't go back-to-back years at Florida State not making a bowl game. Get Cam Akers back, one of the best running backs in football. Your O-line, though, still terrible. And you need to solve the quarterback situation down there, so we'll see. Pittsburgh, was Pittsburgh your second-best team last year? No, but close to it. And they were a 7-win team and won the division. I mean, this is... That half of the division was just terrible. Pitt won it with 7 games and then took a beating to Clemson in the ACC title game. Virginia Tech, 6-7. Duke, 8-5. Third or fourth best team in the ACC. Problem is they lost Daniel Jones, who really propped them up last year in a weak ACC. He got drafted, 6th overall, whatever, to the Giants. You can't imagine Duke repeating 8 wins again next year. I don't see it happening. So one of the teams that propped you up last year, Duke, headed for a nosedive, I think. And then you got a series of 7-win teams. Now, these teams aren't terrible, but they're just forgettable. I mean, you would be hard-pressed to find very many fans who can remember much of anything about these teams from last season. These are all 7-win teams here. Wake Forest, Boston College, Georgia Tech, Miami Hurricanes. Now, Miami, of course, a lot of hype there with the new coach, Manny Diaz. And of this group of 7-win teams, obviously Miami has the most talent and the most potential to turn into a good, really good or elite program, although I question whether or not that can happen this year. I do think Miami's record will be way better this year. Their schedule is a joke. They only play one ranked team all year, that being Florida week 1. Miami should win that division this year, easily should have 10 wins. Unfortunately, I don't think that means Miami is going to be Miami's going to get to 10 wins. That doesn't mean they're a good or an elite team, I don't think. I think it'll be a product of their schedule. They'll still get blown out by Clemson. 7 wins last year. Virginia, 8 wins. NC State, 9 wins. Syracuse, 10 wins. So Syracuse and NC State, second, third best teams. Pitt, an okay team. Virginia, an okay team. Everybody else just forgettable or terrible in the ACC. I have them as the 5th ranked conference. All right, coming in at 4th on this list, ranking the Power 5 conferences, I have the Pac-12. Listen, if some people want to put the ACC 4th and Pac-12 4th, that's fine. In fact, the only place I'm certain about on this list, to be honest, is the conference I have number 1. I think you could argue legitimately that any of the other 4, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, and 5th place could be moved up or down a spot, but I've got the Pac-12 coming in at 4th. Why? 5 teams with a losing record. 4 of them in that South Division. The South Division is terrible. It would rival that division in the ACC in terms of being the worst division in college football. The Pac-12 only had 2 teams that finished with 10 or more wins. That's bad, and they were both in the same state, Washington and Washington State. Washington, of course, went on to win the Pac-12, showed up in the Rose Bowl, and got absolutely obliterated by Ohio State. So the Pac-12 just not very good last year overall. Only made how many times Pac-12 made the playoffs? Once. I think it was once with Washington. Got beat down, and no Pac-12 team is yet to return. Who else is even in the Pac-12? Well, you have some really, some epically bad teams. Oregon State is terrible year in and year out. We mentioned some teams in the ACC that were real bad last year, winning 2 games, Louisville and UNC. That was sort of an outlying year for those 2 teams. You don't typically see those teams. Now, not that those teams are typically winning 10 or 11 games, but you don't normally see North Carolina or Louisville sitting in the 2-3 win range. You do see that with Oregon State. They've been terrible for a really long time, 2-10. So the trend continues last year. I do think they'll be a little bit better this year, but not bowl better. I mean, they're not going to win 6 or more games. They're still going to be one of the worst teams in America. Chip Kelly and UCLA didn't do much better at 3-9, but Chip Kelly was installing. Listen, if you didn't see a bad year coming for UCLA last year, then you're either the most blind UCLA homer on the face of the earth, or you just don't understand football. Chip Kelly runs one of the most complicated offenses in all of college football in terms of the speed and the precision that it takes to run that offense the way he wants it to be ran. And if that offense is not ran close to 100% the right way, then everything falls apart for a Chip Kelly team because the defense ends up staying on the field the entire game because the offense can't get first downs and they're snapping the ball every 12 or 11 seconds. It's just a recipe for disaster. So I'm not surprised they went 3-9. They did look better in the second half of the year, which was expected as the offense sort of got a little bit better as the year went along. I think UCLA has the potential to be one of the most improved teams in terms of overall record in all of college football this year, partly because I think they're going to be a better team than what they put on the field last year, and partly because they just play in a pretty bad division. And here's the biggest problem with the Pac-12. And the ACC shares this problem too in terms of the way Florida State and Miami have been playing. Southern Cal 5-7. This cannot happen in the Pac-12. In order for the Pac-12 to be a legitimate conference that people take seriously, whether you love Southern Cal or hate them, they've got to be winning more than 5 games a year for the Pac-12 as a whole to be considered a good league. 5-7 is terrible. Why they decided to keep Clay Helton last year is beyond me. Well, actually, should he have been fired? Yeah, this is inexcusable 5-7 with the talent that Southern Cal has. But we all know why they kept him. Coaching change coming after this year. Yeah, and we already know who it is. But yeah, 5-7. I think they have the potential to be better this year, but from what I've seen from Clay Helton, the coach out there, nothing, you can't tell me anything that's going to make me think they're winning 10 or 11 games. I don't think Helton's capable of doing it. Do I think they can win more than 5? Yeah, but not a whole lot more. 7 or 8 maybe. Arizona 5-7, year 1 under Kevin Sumlin. Now this is a team I think can get a lot better this year. Sumlin, Khalil Tate's back. I think they'll be better this year. Herm Edwards 7-6 at Arizona State. I don't think they can get much better. I think what I think happened at Arizona State is I think they brought in a coach in Herm Edwards who has coached for 100 years. I think he got the absolute most out of the talent he had at Arizona State last year, and they benefited from being in probably the worst division in all of college football, the Pac-12 South. I mentioned 4 teams in that division had losing records, and still Arizona State was only able to get to 7-6. Not a great team. Cal 7-6. Oregon and Stanford, pretty good years, 9-4. Utah, of course, 9-5. Washington 10-4. Washington State 11-2. So I mean, you have a lot of year 2 head coaches in the Pac-12 going into 2019, right? You've got Arizona with a second-year coach, Arizona State with a second-year coach, Oregon State, and UCLA, all with second-year coaches this year. The Pac-12 could move up in this list this year. Some of these second-year head coaches have better years than they had the first year. If Southern Cal somehow gets on a roll and wins, 8, 9, or 10 games, and if either Washington or Oregon can run the table, win the Pac-12, and make the college football playoff, that would go a long way, I think, towards maybe bumping the Pac-12 up to the 3rd or the 2nd spot next year or something like that, depending on how it works out. But right now, I've got them sitting at number 4. All right, and this one is probably going to be the most controversial, if I had to guess, on my list here. And I did struggle with this one. I'm not going to lie. I strongly considered putting this conference at number 2. But the more I looked at and compared these 2 conferences, I decided I had to go with this one for 3rd, and it's the Big Ten. There's been a narrative in college football the last few years that the Big Ten East is the best, or maybe the 2nd best division in all of college football. Now, while I don't necessarily think that's the craziest thing I've ever heard, and it may be true, it's hard to believe that the 2nd best division or the best division in all of college football can't get a team in the playoff for 3 years straight. That's hard to believe. Or 2 years straight, 17 and 18. Shut out in the playoffs the 2 years before that. Of course, Michigan State shut out, Ohio State shut out. That was in 15 and 16. And then nobody in the Big Ten made it in 17. Nobody in the Big Ten made it in 18. Now, you're going to say, well, the reason they can't get anybody in is because the division is so hard. Well, when they talk about it being the hardest division, which division is it that they always compare it to? The SEC West. The SEC West has had a representative in the playoff every single year, one that has won the playoff multiple times. So I'm not saying I'm there yet, but I am starting to consider the idea that the Big Ten East is vastly overrated. I'm just starting to consider that. Now, Ohio State showed up and showed out in the Rose Bowl last year and absolutely obliterated Washington. That alone almost made me bump them up to 2, but like I said, I settled on 3 here. If you want to tell me I'm wrong and the Big Ten should be 2nd, I totally get it. I think this is close between 3 and 2, but I went with 3rd here. 5 teams with a losing record in the Big Ten. That's another thing that heavily factored into this. Only 2 teams with 10 or more wins. So, 2 teams that people could consider elite, right? If you're winning 10 or more games, I know this is a trash talk channel and you got teams that go 10 and 3 and people laugh and say, "Ha, you're terrible." But the reality is in college football today, if you're winning 10 or more games, you're a pretty good team. You had 2 of them. 5 teams with losing records. Let's just run through it. Of course, Ohio State 13-1, Michigan 10-3, Penn State 1-9, Northwestern 9, Iowa 9. Those are all good teams, okay? Well, you can argue Northwestern Now, Wisconsin 8-5, one of the most disappointing teams in all of the Power 5 last year with the talent they had coming back, the offensive line, Jonathan Taylor, returning quarterback. They should have won 10 games in their sleep. 8-5 for Wisconsin is embarrassing. Minnesota, 7 wins. Michigan State, 7 wins. Illinois and Nebraska, 4 wins. And then Indiana, Maryland, and Purdue, 5-5 and 6 wins, respectively. So those are your 5 teams with the losing record. Of course, Ohio State, Urban Meyer out, Ryan Day in, Dwayne Haskins out, along with every other quarterback they had, and in comes Justin Fields. Ohio State still probably has the most talented roster in the Big Ten, but with such a huge question mark at the quarterback position because we just don't know how Justin Fields is going to perform in a game day situation because we haven't seen it. A little bit of playing time at UGA last year, but not much, and nowhere near the type of offense that we'll see him running at Ohio State. I'm high on Justin Fields. I think he can play well, but let's just be real. It's a huge question mark right now. Ryan Day, first-year head coach, Ohio State thinks he's going to come in just like Lincoln Riley did and not skip a beat. Of course, I can name 100 other coaches that took over a successful program and didn't do so well. So Ohio State wants to go the Oklahoma route. We'll see if it does, or if they take a step or two back for a few years while Ryan Day sort of learns how to be a head coach, which is something you have to learn. What else here? Michigan, Harbaugh. Can he win the big game? Can he finally win the division? Can he finally beat Ohio State? Can he finally make it to the Big Ten title game? Could he even possibly win the Big Ten title game? Whoever wins out of the Big Ten East will be the favorite in the Big Ten title game. It's just a much better division than the West. But, I mean, I don't know. Those are question marks. Patterson comes back. The offense should take another step forward this year, I would think. Defense lose a ton of talent, but they've recruited really well over there. If Ohio State stumbles, Michigan should be there to sort of take the lead there in the Big Ten. We'll see. Penn State, they got quarterback issues. Guy transferred out, a fifth-year senior. I don't know what they're going to do there. James Franklin, I'm high on this guy. Won the Big Ten a couple of years ago. Lost a close one in the Rose Bowl. But it just seems like Penn State's going to be an 8, 9, 10 win team again this year, doesn't it? It just seems that way to me. Wisconsin, I'm done buying them. I've been high on Wisconsin the last couple of years. Wisconsin went forever winning 10, 11 games a year, but nothing else. Last year, they fell on their face at 8-5 with a loaded team. I'm done buying what they're selling. Nebraska, to me, is the wild card in the Big Ten. If Nebraska can go from... Can Nebraska get to 8 or 9 wins? If Nebraska can go from 4 wins to 8 or 9 wins, then that, to me, that would be enough to bump the Big Ten up to number 2. And they're the wild card. I mean, it's possible Nebraska could go on a run here and win 9, 10, possibly even 11 games if you count the bowl game this year. I like Scott Frost. I like Adrian Martinez, their quarterback. They got to get better play defensively. They got to figure out some things with the running back position. But to me, they're the wild card in the Big Ten. And if they have another down year where they win 4, 5, or 6 games, then I think it's likely the Big Ten remains as about the 3rd best conference. If they can step up and sort of get into that Ohio State, Michigan, Penn State territory, then I think that'd be enough to elevate the Big Ten into definitely the number 2 spot. But I've got them 3rd right now in my list of the Power 5 conferences. All right, number 2, the Big 12, and I surprised even myself here by landing on 2 with the Big 12. Big 12 has been considered one of the worst Power 5 conferences in a lot of years over the last 4 or 5 years, and there's some reasons for that. Number 1, Texas had some really, really down years. Texas is one of those teams, sort of like Southern Cal in the Pac-12, sort of like Florida State and Miami in the ACC. When they're having really bad years, it's hard to consider the Big 12 to be an upper echelon conference. They had a great year last year. To me, that was enough to elevate the Big 12 up to the number 2 spot here. West Virginia was also a really good team last year. Iowa State surprised some people. So I think there's reason to be optimistic if you're a Big 12 fan, or if your team is in the Big 12. You had some pretty good teams last year. Now, will it continue next year? And this is where I struggle with 2 and 3 for the Big 12 and the Big 10. I think the Big 10 is more likely to do better. I think the Big 10 will be a better conference in 2019. Probably than the Big 12, and that's why I sort of, but like I said, I'm using 2018 too to look at this, and this is why I kind of struggled, and I understand some of the disagreements and arguments are going to come in the comment section. I totally get it, but 3 teams with a losing record over there in the Big 12. Of course, Kansas brings in a new coach. They won 3 games. I mean, Kansas is just a terrible team. I mean, they've only won 4 or 5 games total over the last 3 or 4 years. Just one of the absolute worst teams in America. Les Miles comes in. He's no miracle worker. I mean, Kansas is not making a bowl game next year. They have a horrible scholarship situation that I described in a best case, worst case video I did about Kansas a week or so ago, Click back a few videos if you want to check that out. But their previous coach really screwed them over in terms of scholarship numbers and things like that. I'm not going to get into all that here because I already covered it, but they're in a real bad spot there. Kansas State brings in a new coach. They finally got rid of the Skeletor out there, and they bring in a new coach, some guy named, what's his name? Kleeman? Who? I never heard of this guy. I don't know. But they're a 5-win team. Texas Tech, a 5-win team. Tell me if this sounds familiar. Texas Tech had a great offense and a terrible defense last year. Does that sound familiar? Yeah, sounds like it must be a Big 12 team, and it is. Let's see. You had 4 teams, that's it, win more than 7 games. So you had a lot of average to below average teams in the Big 12 last year, but 4 teams won over 7. Oklahoma, Texas, West Virginia, and Iowa State, right? Oklahoma downgrading at the quarterback position this year. Now, before you get mad about that or want to defend Jalen Hurts, when you lose Kyler Murray, no matter who you get, it's going to be a downgrade. This was he had one of the best seasons that any college quarterback has ever had, okay? He ran for 1 million yards. He threw for 1 million yards, a ton of touchdowns. He single-handedly carried that offense a couple of times during the season in some big spots. Jalen Hurts is just not that good. Not as good as Kyler Murray. Listen, he couldn't start at Alabama. He's coming to your place, and he's starting. That's just what it is. You're lucky to have him, in my opinion, over what you had there. He's got a ton of experience. I think he'll have a really good year. But he's no Kyler Murray. Okay, and you still have no defense. 130th last year. You replace your defensive coordinator. You bring in Alex Grinch. Great. Let's say he's the best defensive coordinator on planet Earth. The talent still isn't there. Even if you improve 50 or 60 spots nationally in terms of total defense, you're still sitting around the 60th or 70th spot in total defense. Can Oklahoma win 11 games in the regular season and win the Big 12 and make the playoff again? Yeah, of course they can. Are they going to win the playoff game with that bad of a defense? No, it's going to be a different verse, same as the first. Texas, first of all, let me say this. I think Texas is overhyped this year. I don't think Texas is making the playoff. Could they win the Big 12? Yes, but it would be a case, I think, where they finished the regular season with 2 or 3 losses, but still made the Big 12 title game and then beat an undefeated or 1-loss Oklahoma, knocking the Big 12 completely out of the playoff. I don't think they're a playoff team. I think they're way overhyped based off a victory over a Georgia team that played absolutely pitiful in the Sugar Bowl. I'm not here to make excuses about that. You guys won the game, and I've congratulated you 1,000,000 times on that, but the reality is you're putting way too much stock into that win over Georgia. I'm just telling you. West Virginia, they were pretty good last year. They're going to take a step back. Now, I do like the coach they brought in, Troy Brown, or Neil Brown, I think it is, from Troy. Yeah, that's right, Troy. Troy Brown from Neil. No, Neil Brown from Troy. What's Troy known for? Well, they beat the Corn Dogs on homecoming, didn't they? Yeah, they did. So you bring him in. The problem is not just the coaching change. It's losing Will Grier and those NFL wide receivers. West Virginia doesn't recruit at a level to be able to replace that in 1 year, my opinion. Now, can they still win 7, 8, maybe even 9 games? I don't know about 9. They could win 7 or 8, though. Iowa State, are they the 3rd best team in the Big 12? I don't even say anything else about the Big 12. Iowa State, 3rd best team. Okay, let me stop and get serious for a minute. Yeah, Iowa State is probably the 3rd best team in the Big 12. I think TCU is poised to be better this year. Maybe TCU ends up being the 3rd best team, but Iowa State, a lot of excitement around there for whatever reason. I don't know. Of course, you can't win a game there. Forget about it. If you look at your schedule, you see a game that's being played at Iowa State, you just go ahead and chalk that up for a loss. There's some mumble guy on YouTube who does Oklahoma videos. You can just ask him, but you can't win a game there. But TCU was 7-6 last year. I think they make a huge step forward. By huge, I mean at least 2 or 3 games. I see an 8-4, 9-3 type season for TCU. Baylor, 7-6. I think it's possible they get a little bit better too. I would still pick TCU ahead of Baylor right now, but Baylor, I think, gets a little bit better. Oklahoma State, again, a wild card team, in my opinion. Oklahoma State, I don't know, it seems like they play a couple of games early in the season and get everyone's attention. But then, some point during the middle, towards the end of the season, you just forget they exist, and then you look down, you're like, oh, they went 8-5 again. Okay. Some people's dark horse to compete for the Big 12 this year is Oklahoma State. But in terms of ranking the conferences, Oklahoma State was 8-5. Can they win 10 games next year and maybe elevate the Big 12? They could. It's probably more likely they win 7 or 8 again, though. But we'll see. Of course, they got one of the most entertaining coaches in all of college football, this Gundy. I mean, this guy used to be 40, That was about 6 years ago, so I reckon he's about 45 or 46 now. I don't know. But he does have a mullet, which is, 6 of one, half a dozen of the other, I guess. But anyway, I know it's controversial, and I spend a lot of time ragging on the Big 12 for good reason. But after looking through all the numbers from last year, who's coming back, what I think teams might do next year, as of right now, I have the Big 12 as the second-ranked conference. All right, and, no surprise, SEC. Oh, he's an SEC homer. Oh, of course he said the SEC is number one. He's a Georgia fan and an SEC homer. What have Georgia done? We'll get off Bama's nuts, woo. Listen, a lot of those things are true. I am a Georgia fan. I am an SEC homer. I do always pull for the SEC to win non-con games against other teams. All those things are true. You know what else is true? The SEC is just clearly the best conference in college football. Just because I'm an SEC homer doesn't make me wrong about that. Look up any list anywhere on the internet ranking the 5 conferences. You're going to see the SEC at the top spot. You look at, the final poll of last year. Alabama, second, weren't they? Who else was in the top 10? Georgia, LSU, and Florida. You had 4 teams last year finish the regular season ranked in the top 10. Throw Kentucky into the mix, you had 5 teams ranked in the top 15. That's a third of the top 15. 40% of the top 10 was SEC teams. We just had an NFL draft. 64 players drafted out of the SEC. Over 20-something more than from any other conference. And that wasn't a one-time deal. Go back and look at the last 10 NFL drafts. Almost every single time, the SEC gets more players drafted than anyone else. Look at the top 10 recruiting rankings. What do you notice? Most of the top 10 teams come from the SEC. The SEC has more top 10 teams in the recruiting rankings than any other conference. The SEC has the best record against the other Power 5 conferences than any other conference over the last whatever amount of time you want to look at, going back 5, 10, 15 years. The SEC is just clearly the best conference. Look at 2019. You're going to have two SEC teams ranked in the top 3 of every preseason poll that comes out. Alabama's going to be probably 2, maybe 1 in some polls. Georgia's going to be 3rd in the majority of the polls you look at. No lower, though, than 4th. But I'll give you that. So 2 of the top 4 heading into 2019 are going to be SEC teams. Who else is in the top 10 in the SEC? LSU, Florida. Some people have Texas A&M in the top 10. So, I can make a case that half the teams in the SEC are top 20 teams. Half. That's 7 of the top 20. I can make the argument. The SEC, just clearly the best league. That doesn't mean there ain't no bad teams here, though. They'll run through some of the same stuff we ran through for the other conferences. Arkansas, one of the worst teams in America. 2-10. In fact, the SEC had 4 teams with losing records. Tennessee, Arkansas, Ole Miss, and Vandy. Okay, all had losing records. Tennessee, of course, 5-7 for what seems like the 100th year. Arkansas, 2-10, one of the worst teams in America. Again, they've been really bad for a while. Historically, epically bad last year, 2-10. But they had a first-year head coach who was in a situation, in my mind, similar to Chip Kelly at UCLA, trying to install an entirely new system of offense that just didn't fit the players that were there. You have to think Arkansas has the potential to be one of the most improved teams this year in terms of win-loss record. Would not surprise me to see Arkansas get to 5 or 6 wins this year. And I know Arkansas fans think it could be higher, but realistically, you could triple your wins this year, which would be a great step in the right direction. Ole Miss 5-7, but no one really cares about them because they bought a bunch of players and then didn't win anything and ended up on probation and bowl bans and stuff, so people forget they even have a team. But they were 5-7. Breaking news, they'll win more than 5 games this year, I'm just telling you now. Vandy, 6-7. They actually were a 500 team during the season and lost their bowl game. So Vandy's about the 4th worst team in the SEC. And for all intents and purposes, they whipped Notre Dame in South Bend last year in every conceivable way except the final score. Vandy had every opportunity to win that game. Notre Dame got extremely lucky to escape from Vanderbilt with a win. So the 4th best team, given Notre Dame all they can handle, an undefeated playoff team. The Barn went 8-5 last year. They will probably take a step back this year. I don't see Auburn winning 8 games this year. I'm just being realistic. South Carolina, middle of the road team, 7-6. Got absolutely humiliated also in 2. In their bowl game. But South Carolina, I don't really see them getting a whole lot better this year. I don't see them getting much worse either, though. I think they're going to be around the 6-7 win mark this year. Mississippi State, 8-5. Some question marks there. They lose some amazing players on defense. But year 2 of a head coach, year 2, an important year for head coaches. And you see a lot of improvement, usually year 1 to 2 for a new head coach. Of course, Kirby, 8-5 his first year, made the national title game his second year. You've seen this a lot. I talked about the Pac-12 schools earlier, a bunch of teams heading into their second year with a head coach. You expect some improvement there. So we'll see what happens at Mississippi State. And then you had 5 teams, 5 with 10 wins or more. And I think it was the Big Ten I was talking about or whatever. You win 10 or more games, you're a pretty good team. SEC had 5 of them, by far the most of any conference. Kentucky and Florida and LSU all had 10 wins. Georgia, 11 wins. Alabama, 14 wins, right? Yeah, most bowl eligible teams. I mean, the barn was Auburn was not very good. 8-5, 5th or 6th worst team in the SEC last year. Lost to Tennessee. Beat Washington. I mean, one of the middle of the road to slightly below average SEC teams beat Washington. I just don't see how you could, like I said in the beginning of the video, you can argue spots 2 through 5 of this poll if you want to. If you try to tell me the SEC is not the best conference and your only reason is that I'm an SEC homer, really, I don't care what the reason is. The SEC is clearly the best conference in all of college football. Feel free to argue or disagree on 2 through 5. If you try to argue that the SEC is not number 1, then you're just a football illiterate. And I really don't have any time or patience for that. Anyway, I'd still like you to have a good morning.